The African savanna stretched endlessly before Daniel Brown, its vast, dry expanse seemingly devoid of life. The heat was suffocating, and the golden grass waved in the breeze, offering little respite. It was supposed to be a straightforward mission, one that Daniel had done 100 times before. But today, everything felt different. The oppressive silence of the land seemed to weigh heavily on his chest, and despite the cool morning hours, he could feel the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. He adjusted his pack and took another swig from his nearly empty water bottle, the bitter taste of sand lingering on his tongue. The heat would soon become unbearable, and if he didn't find water soon, he wouldn't be able to continue his mission. He looked around cautiously, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of poachers or animals. "They're out here, I know it," he thought. Poachers had been a problem for months now, and the lion pride he had sworn to protect was in danger. If Daniel didn't stop them soon, the lions might not survive another hunting season. "Stay focused," Daniel muttered to himself, his voice a low rasp. His hands gripped his rifle tightly, knuckles white from the effort. He needed to be sharp. He needed to be ready for whatever came next. The lives of those lions depended on him. The day wore on, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, searing the earth beneath him. Daniel's stomach growled, but he pushed aside his hunger, his sole focus on the task ahead. His eyes caught something unusual, fresh tire tracks in the dirt. They were deep, unmistakable. Poachers had been here recently. Daniel crouched beside the tracks, his hands trembling as he knelt to examine them. "This is bad," he whispered. The poachers were close. His instincts told him to be cautious, but the urgency in his gut pushed him forward. He knew the lions weren't the only ones at risk. The entire ecosystem was in jeopardy if these poachers were allowed to continue. He had to stop them, and he had to stop them now. The hours passed as Daniel tracked the poachers' trail deeper into the savanna. Sweat drenched his shirt, and his legs felt like they were made of lead. He could barely see straight anymore, his vision blurring in the intense heat. The sun had moved higher in the sky, and Daniel's mind began to fog with dehydration. His mouth was dry, and his body screamed for rest. But he pushed on. "Just a little further," Daniel said to himself, though his voice sounded weak. The poachers had to be close. He stumbled over a rock, his foot catching on the uneven ground. He fell forward onto his hands and knees, the impact rattling his teeth. Pain shot up his arms, but he gritted his teeth and tried to push himself up. But his strength was failing him. I can't do this," he thought, his vision darkening at the edges. His body was shutting down, and he could feel the pull of unconsciousness drawing him in. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground. The world spun around him as he lay there, unable to move. His breaths were shallow, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he struggled to stay conscious. The heat felt like it was suffocating him, and his thoughts were fragmented. He couldn't focus on anything except the overwhelming feeling of weakness that overtook him. The sound of movement nearby caught Daniel's attention, but he couldn't raise his head. His eyes fluttered open and shut as he tried to piece together what was happening. His heart skipped a beat as he heard the unmistakable growl of a predator. "Nu, nu, nu." Daniel thought frantically, this can't be how it ends. The growls grew louder, and Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure if it was a lion, a hyena, or some other predator, but he knew he was in serious danger. He could hear the crunch of footsteps, heavy, deliberate. The animals were circling him. And then, unexpectedly, there was silence. Daniel blinked, trying to focus. He couldn't make sense of it. Where were the sounds of the predators? The growls? The rustling? It was eerie, unnervingly quiet. "Hello," Daniel called weakly, his voice barely more than a whisper. His throat was dry, and he had no strength to call louder. He tried to lift his head again, his neck aching with the effort, but he couldn't. His limbs felt like lead, his body unable to move. His vision was fading, but something unusual caught his eye. A shape standing in the distance, a large silhouette looming against the bright savanna sky. The figure was large, much larger than any animal he had ever seen before. As his vision cleared, Daniel's heart stilled in awe. A lion stood before him. Not just any lion, but a massive male lion, his mane thick and dark. His eyes locked onto Daniel with an intensity that left him breathless. The lion took a slow step forward and then another. Daniel could feel the tension in the air, the heavy weight of the predator's presence. But to his shock, the lion didn't charge. It simply watched him. Behind the lion, other figures emerged. More lions, forming a circle around Daniel. Their golden eyes reflected the same intensity, but there was no aggression, no attacks. The male lion, the one closest to him, stepped forward again. Daniel's breath caught as their eyes met. There was something deeply familiar in those eyes, something he couldn't place. A distant memory stirred in his mind. The cub, he thought, as the lion lowered his massive head, as if recognizing him. The memory flashed back to Daniel's earlier days in the savannah, when he had risked his life to save a lion cub caught in a poacher's trap. The cub had been small, terrified, and bleeding, but Daniel had done everything he could to free it, to save it from certain death. Could this be the same lion? Daniel thought, his pulse quickening. The male lion, whom Daniel now recognized as the grown cub he had saved, let out a low growl, a warning to any nearby threats. But there was no threat. The lion stood in silent protection. Daniel, struggling to remain conscious, let the waves of relief wash over him. He had been found, yes, but by who? By what? The lions surrounding him didn't seem to be predators anymore. They weren't hungry. They weren't angry. They were simply there, keeping him safe. The pride stood watch over him as he fought to stay awake, as his body screamed for rest. The dry heat, the desperation, the isolation, they all seemed to fade away as Daniel lay there, powerless, but protected. He finally closed his eyes for a moment, knowing that for the first time in his life, he wasn't alone in the savannah. Daniel's mind was clouded, the intense heat and the lack of water pulling him into the darkness of unconsciousness. But something, some force, kept him tethered to the present, to the savannah, to this strange encounter. He fought against the pull of sleep, trying to hold onto the moment, trying to understand what was happening. He opened his eyes once more, barely able to focus, but the sight before him made his breath catch in his throat. The massive male lion, Ku, was still there, standing just a few feet away. The lion's golden eyes were fixed on him with such intensity that it sent a shiver down his spine. There was no hostility in the lion's gaze, but there was something profound, something deeply knowing. The other lions in the pride had arranged themselves around him, their muscular bodies positioned in a circle, watching, waiting. Each lion seemed to embody an aura of silent strength, a quiet power that could not be ignored. There was no growling, no snapping of teeth. The lions were simply present. Daniel's mind, struggling to stay alert, began to connect the dots. The cub, he thought again, his thoughts drifting between memory and reality. The memory was a hazy blur, but he could see it clearly now. The young lion, caught in a poacher's snare, writhing in pain. It had been a quiet, tense moment, one that had tested his every instinct. He had been deep in the savannah that day, trekking toward a poacher's hideout when he had heard the desperate cries of the cub. The trap was crude, the wires tight around its tiny legs. Daniel had known that the cub wouldn't survive for long if he didn't act fast. The lion had been scared, vicious, desperate, but Daniel had managed to free it, calming the animal with his touch, the warmth of his hands in a moment of shared fear. When the cub finally ran, its eyes never left him. And now, all these years later, Daniel wondered if this was the same lion, the same creature that had run into the wild, grown strong and fierce, and now stood as a protector over him. Is it possible? Daniel wondered, his body too weak to process the realization. Ku, the lion closest to him, took a step forward. The massive creature's form blocked the harsh sun from Daniel's face, casting a shadow of cool relief over him. He felt a strange sense of calm wash over him in that moment, despite the chaos of his situation. You're not attacking me?" Daniel rasped, his voice hoarse and barely a whisper. It was a strange thing to ask, but in his delirious state, it was all he could manage. The lion's eyes remained locked with his, unblinking, as if considering the question. Daniel, too weak to keep his eyes open for long, blinked slowly, unsure if the lion even understood him. But there was something about Ku's stare, a recognition, a sense of knowing, that made Daniel feel like the lion was answering him, even if just in silence. The night descended quickly, and with it, the familiar sounds of the savannah shifted. The lions, their duty to protect Daniel evident, began to grow more alert, their bodies tense. It was then that Daniel heard the faint but unmistakable cackling in the distance. Hyenas. His heart skipped a beat, fear jolting through his weakened body. Hyenas weren't just scavengers. They were opportunistic hunters, and a lone, vulnerable human was the perfect target. The lions could fend for themselves, but he was helpless. Not now, Daniel muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. His body ached for the safety of his camp, for the comfort of the rangers he had left behind. But there was no way out. The hyenas were drawing closer, and he was too weak to move. Ku seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere, his ears pricking forward as his eyes narrowed. The rest of the pride stirred, their low growls rumbling in the air. The lions moved with incredible coordination, slipping into position, their eyes scanning the horizon. Daniel could see the muscles in Ku's shoulders tense, the lion's body ready for action. Then, without a sound, the lions spread out in a semicircle, each one taking a position to guard him. Ku moved to stand directly in front of Daniel, towering over him like an impenetrable wall. His massive frame, framed by the twilight, was the perfect barrier between Daniel and the approaching hyenas. The cackling grew louder, closer, until Daniel could hear the unmistakable sound of hyenas' paws crunching the dry earth, their scent heavy in the wind. It was a terrifying sound, low, guttural, and filled with hunger. But Daniel did not feel the same terror that he had felt before. Instead, he felt protected. He watched as the lions moved with effortless grace, their bodies in perfect sync. Ku growled once, a deep, resonating sound that made the hairs on the back of Daniel's neck stand on end. The hyenas faltered, their advance slowing as the lions made it clear that they were not to be trifled with. The hyenas, knowing the risk of attacking a pride of lions, hesitated. They cackled nervously, looking for an opening, but the lions held their ground. Then, Ku let out a series of sharp, commanding roars, his voice cutting through the night air like thunder. The hyenas, clearly intimidated by the lions' display of dominance, began to retreat, their nervous, high-pitched calls echoing into the distance. Daniel watched, his breath shallow as he lay there, surrounded by these powerful animals. The lions had fended off the threat, their primal strength protecting him without question. Ku didn't even glance back at him, but Daniel could feel the lion's presence. Steady, unwavering, a silent promise of safety. As the night wore on, the lions took turns keeping watch. Daniel was too exhausted to stay awake for long, his eyelids heavy with the pull of sleep. But before he drifted into unconsciousness, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of gratitude. He had come to the savannah to stop poachers, but now the lions, his former enemies, had become his unexpected guardians. In the quiet of the savannah, under the watchful eyes of the lion pride, Daniel finally allowed himself to relax. For the first time since he had collapsed in the desert heat, he felt at peace. The lions remained by his side throughout the night, a steadfast presence in the otherwise silent savannah. Daniel's body, bruised and worn from the elements, finally found the rest it desperately needed. His mind swirled with confusion, trying to piece together the events of the past hours. How had this happened? Why had the lions protected him? But those questions, for the moment, could wait. The lions had acted without hesitation, standing as guardians over him. Daniel could only wonder what the next day would bring. And so, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Daniel drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep, surrounded by the silent protectors of the wild. The first light of dawn pierced through the horizon, casting a soft glow over the savannah. The night had passed without incident, but the air was still thick with tension. The lions, who had remained vigilant through the night, were now moving slowly, stretching their powerful limbs, their eyes scanning the area with unyielding focus. Daniel, still lying prone on the ground, stirred from his sleep, his body aching as he slowly came back to consciousness. The desert heat of the previous day seemed to linger in his bones, the sensation of dehydration still hanging heavy in his body. He blinked against the rising sun, squinting as the light hit his eyes. It took a few moments for his brain to catch up with his senses. As he became more aware of his surroundings, he realized that the lions had not moved far. They were still there, close by, watching him, silent, still, and fierce. Ku, the lion who had stood guard over him the entire night, was now slowly walking in a circle around him. The lion's massive paws barely made a sound on the ground as he moved, his golden eyes fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made his breath catch. There was a strange, unspoken bond between them, something beyond simple survival, something deeper, like an understanding that transcended words. "You're still here," Daniel muttered, his voice barely audible. His throat was dry, but somehow he felt safe. The lions had protected him from the hyenas last night. He had been surrounded by predators, but instead of feeling the sharp sting of danger, he had felt their protection. As Daniel tried to sit up, his body protested, sending waves of weakness through his limbs. He groaned quietly, trying to ignore the pain. Ku watched him closely, his powerful body standing like a silent sentinel, always ready. There was no aggression in the lion's posture, just calm and measured patience, as if Ku were waiting for Daniel to make the next move. For a moment, Daniel considered the strange reality of the situation. He had been a ranger for years, protecting animals from poachers, and yet here he was, helpless, saved by the very creatures he had once viewed as threats. The irony was not lost on him. The first hyena's cackle broke the stillness, a sharp, almost eerie sound that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. He immediately froze, eyes wide as he scanned the distance. His heart began to race. The hyenas were back. As if sensing the immediate danger, Ku turned his head toward the sound, his body going tense in an instant. The rest of the pride followed suit, their movements becoming slow and deliberate. The tension in the air thickened, and Daniel felt the weight of the moment. The lions were prepared for what was coming. But Daniel, he was not. The hyenas were closer now, and the pack was large, far too many for Daniel to count with his blurry vision. They were circling, closing in on the lion pride, their cackles growing louder with each step they took. The hyenas could smell weakness, and they weren't about to pass up an opportunity. Daniel was as vulnerable as he could possibly be, weak, dehydrated, unable to defend himself. He had no weapon, no means of escape. The lions, however, were not panicked. Ku, the leader, moved to the front of the group, his massive body forming an imposing barrier between Daniel and the hyenas. The other lions stood firm, creating a line of defense. Their low growls vibrated through the air, each one a warning. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he watched the scene unfold before him. The hyenas were relentless, their eyes glowing with hunger, their jaws salivating. They circled like vultures, ready to pounce at the first sign of weakness. Then, Ku did something Daniel never expected. He roared. The sound was deafening, primal, thunderous, and filled with authority. It shook the ground beneath Daniel's body, reverberating through the savannah like a battle cry. The hyenas faltered, their cackles fading into hesitant whines. Another roar followed, and this time, the hyenas retreated, the force of Ku's voice unmistakable. The lions, all in unison, took one step forward, signaling their dominance. But the hyenas were not done. Their hunger was too strong. They surged forward, trying to challenge the lions, looking for an opening. Ku did not hesitate. He lunged, his massive paws striking the ground with brutal force as he charged toward the nearest hyena. The rest of the pride followed, their powerful bodies moving as one, swift and calculated. Daniel, still lying prone on the ground, could hardly believe what he was seeing. The lions were not just defending themselves, they were attacking, fighting back with incredible ferocity. He watched, mesmerized, as the lion pride, led by Ku, tore into the hyenas. The sound of growls and snarls filled the air, and for a few moments, it was chaos, wild, untamed, and violent. Ku, with his immense strength, struck with precision, his claws raking through the air and catching one of the hyenas. The other lions were equally as lethal, their movements calculated and deliberate. They fought as a team, working together to drive the hyenas back. The savannah was alive with the raw power of nature, and Daniel, despite his own fear, could not help but be in awe of the lion's strength and unity. The hyenas, realizing they had underestimated their opponents, began to retreat. The pride didn't chase them, they didn't need to. Ku gave one final roar, a warning, and the hyenas vanished into the distance, their retreating forms dissolving into the dusty horizon. Silence fell over the savannah once more, the only sound the heavy breathing of the lions. Ku turned to face Daniel, his massive body still poised in a protective stance. His golden eyes locked onto Daniel's, and for a moment, there was a connection, an unspoken acknowledgement of the danger they had just faced together. Daniel, still lying on the ground, was shaking, though not from fear. His heart pounded with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The lions had not only protected him, they had fought for him, risking their lives to ensure his survival. In that brief, fleeting moment, the predator had become the protector. "Thank you," Daniel whispered, though he wasn't sure if the lion could understand him. His voice was weak, but his words were sincere. Ku didn't respond, he didn't need to. The message was clear. They had done their part. Now it was time for Daniel to do his. The lions slowly began to settle down, their tense bodies relaxing now that the danger had passed. Ku remained close, ever watchful, his eyes scanning the horizon. Daniel, still recovering from the shock, could feel his energy slowly returning, but the harsh reality of his situation had not changed. He was still in the middle of the savannah, still at the mercy of the lions and the unforgiving environment. But for the first time since he had collapsed under the acacia tree, Daniel no longer felt completely alone. The pride had shown him a new side of nature, one that went beyond survival, one that transcended the simple dichotomy of predator and prey. In the world of the savannah, trust had been forged in the most unlikely of ways. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat intensifying, but the savannah remained peaceful for now. The hyena threat had been quelled, and Daniel felt an odd sense of calm wash over him as he lay there, still supported by the presence of the lion pride. Ku, ever the sentinel, remained close by, his intense golden eyes ever watchful, ensuring that no further threats would dare approach. Daniel's mind was a whirlwind. He had been saved, not by the human rangers he had expected to find, but by the very creatures he had sworn to protect. The lions, typically regarded as fierce predators, had shown him a kindness he never would have imagined. But the question gnawed at him, why? Why had they chosen to protect him? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of distant voices. The faint hum of human speech, familiar and comforting, reached his ears. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The rangers, he thought, they've come for me. Ku's gaze flicked towards the noise as well, his body tense. The lions, although guardians, weren't stupid. They had likely heard the approaching rangers long before Daniel had. Daniel watched as Ku moved to the edge of the pride's formation, his powerful body still alert, but not aggressive. The other lions stayed near Daniel, keeping a respectful distance, yet their eyes remained locked on the approaching humans. The sound of footsteps grew closer, and soon, Daniel could make out the figures of two rangers, their khaki uniforms blending with the surroundings. They stopped at the edge of the circle of lions, their eyes widening at the unexpected sight. Is he alive? One of the rangers, a woman named Sarah, whispered, her voice filled with disbelief as she surveyed Daniel. She looked from him to the lions, her face tense with both caution and awe. Daniel's head swam with confusion, but he managed to croak out a weak response. Yes, I'm alive, thanks to them. He gestured toward the lions, his hand trembling as he pointed at Ku. Sarah exchanged a glance with her partner, a man named Tom, who was equally as stunned. Lions? You're saying they didn't? They didn't attack, Daniel interrupted, still unsure if what had happened could be real. They protected me. The hyenas came and they fought them off. Tom stared at the lions, then back at Daniel. You're telling me these lions, the same ones we've been tracking, actually saved you? Daniel nodded weakly, still too exhausted to sit up properly. Yes, strange, but they did. They fought off the hyenas. I don't know why, but they did. Ku remained a few paces away, watching them intently. His eyes locked with Daniel's for a moment, and it felt as if an unspoken understanding passed between them. The pride was not hostile, yet neither was it inclined to simply let Daniel go without a sign of trust. Daniel felt a surge of gratitude toward the lion. Let's move slowly, Sarah said quietly, her hand resting on the rifle slung across her back. She was cautious, but she had been a ranger long enough to know that making sudden moves could provoke the lions. We need to get him to the camp, but we can't force them away. Tom nodded, keeping his distance. Right? But these lions, they're protecting him. We can't interfere with that. Sarah looked back at the lions, meeting Ku's gaze once more. There was a long moment of silence. The pride's calm was almost unnerving, but Sarah had seen this behavior before. She wasn't sure whether it was instinct or something deeper, but there was a certain peace in the air, a mutual respect between human and animal. Let's see if we can help him, she said at last, her voice softer. Sarah and Tom approached slowly, hands raised, showing they meant no harm. Ku watched them closely, his eyes tracking every movement. Despite the tension in the air, Daniel felt a surprising sense of safety. There was no aggression in Ku's stance. Instead, there was an eerie calmness, as if he had made some silent promise to the ranger. The two rangers reached Daniel, kneeling beside him. Sarah immediately began checking his vitals. She spoke softly, "You're lucky, Daniel. You shouldn't have made it through the night with the hyenas around." "I know," Daniel rasped, his voice hoarse. "But they saved me. Those lions. They didn't attack. They protected me." "Lions?" Sarah said again, shaking her head in disbelief. "We've been tracking them for weeks. They're usually much more aggressive." Daniel looked up at Ku, still standing protectively over him. "Maybe they're not as dangerous as we thought." Tom, who had been keeping an eye on the surrounding area, gave a low whistle. "That's the same lion from the tracking reports. It's the one that's been killing off the poachers in the area." The revelation hit Daniel like a hammer. Ku, the lion who had once been a helpless cub, had grown into a powerful leader of this pride, not just surviving, but becoming a force of nature in his own right. The truth settled in Daniel's mind. This lion, the same one he had saved years ago, had come to his rescue. The cub had not forgotten. As the rangers finished assessing Daniel's condition, they slowly began helping him up. His body still felt weak, but with their assistance, he was able to stand, albeit shakily. He turned toward Ku, whose golden eyes met his once more. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. He wasn't sure if Ku could understand him, but he felt it was important to say the words. The lion had done the impossible. He had saved him, just as Daniel had once saved him. Ku didn't move, didn't make a sound. But as Daniel stood there, leaning heavily on Sarah's arm, he swore he saw the faintest flicker of something in the lion's eyes. Was it acknowledgement? Was it gratitude? It was impossible to say. But in that moment, as Ku stood silent and still, Daniel understood that the bond between them was not just one of predator and prey, but something far more profound. It was a bond forged in life-or-death circumstances, in the shared history of survival, of trust. And as the rangers began guiding Daniel away from the pride's territory, Ku didn't stop them. He merely watched, his head raised high, a final gesture of silent trust. He allowed Daniel to go, no questions asked. The days following Daniel's rescue passed in a haze of recovery and reflection. He was back at the ranger camp now, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of human life, things he hadn't truly appreciated before. The constant hum of machinery, the chatter of fellow rangers, the scent of freshly brewed coffee, all felt strangely comforting. But despite the comfort, Daniel couldn't shake the memories of the lions, of Ku's powerful gaze, of the bond they had formed in the wild. His thoughts constantly drifted back to the savannah, where the pride still roamed free, and to the lion who had protected him when he had been at his most vulnerable. It was the third day after his rescue when Daniel finally stood at the edge of the camp's boundary, looking out toward the horizon. His body had healed more quickly than expected, thanks to the care of the rangers and the small bit of luck he had. But his mind was still restless, as though something deep inside him was calling him back to the savannah. "Hey, you feeling better?" Sarah's voice interrupted his thoughts. She appeared beside him, holding a cup of water. Her eyes were soft with concern, but there was also a touch of admiration in her gaze. "I'm getting there," Daniel replied, taking the water and sipping it slowly. He wiped his mouth, then returned his gaze to the horizon. "But I keep thinking about the lions. About Ku." Sarah followed his gaze, squinting toward the distant expanse of the savannah. "It's hard to forget them, isn't it?" Daniel nodded. "I can't explain it. They're just lions. Yet they saved my life. Ku saved my life. I still don't understand why, but I feel like I need to know." Sarah didn't immediately respond, but when she spoke again, her voice was filled with a quiet understanding. "You know, I've heard stories about lions like Ku, predators who don't follow the usual rules of the wild. It's rare, but it happens. Sometimes, an animal's instinct can shift, protecting, not just hunting." Daniel turned to face her. "But why me? I'm not a lion. I'm not one of them. You were the one who saved him, remember? You did something they can't forget." Sarah smiled softly. "Sometimes, animals know when they owe someone. Ku saw you as a protector too. It's a bond, Daniel. One that goes beyond just survival." Daniel thought about her words for a moment. It made sense in a way. The lions, and especially Ku, had not only defended him from the hyenas but had done so without hesitation. There was an ancient understanding in that, the deep-rooted knowledge that life is fragile, and trust, once earned, is unbreakable. Later that day, Daniel set out for a walk on his own, still feeling an itch that he couldn't ignore. The camp had been a relief, but the savannah had been where everything had changed for him. He needed closure. He needed to understand what had happened, and what Ku's role in all of it truly meant. He found himself walking along the same path he had taken before, when he had been tracking the poachers. The heat of the day was relentless, but the familiar sounds of the wild, the distant call of a bird, the rustle of grass in the wind were oddly soothing. As he approached a familiar landmark, the large acacia tree where he had collapsed, he stopped. He could see the faint impressions left by his body in the dirt, the outline of where he had fallen. The memories came rushing back in vivid flashes. The pain, the desperation, and then the sudden, inexplicable calm when the lions had arrived. It was as though the entire world had shifted in that moment, and in a strange way, it felt as if he had been born anew. As Daniel stood there, lost in his thoughts, he felt a presence nearby, a stirring in the wind. He turned, and for the briefest moment, his heart skipped a beat. Standing at the edge of the clearing just out of reach was Ku. The massive lion stood perfectly still, his golden eyes locking with Daniel's. There was no growl, no aggression, just a deep, steady gaze, as though the lion was studying him. The same silence, the same intensity. Ku was there, watching him as he had done that night. For a long moment, neither of them moved. It was as though time itself had paused, giving Daniel the chance to fully absorb the enormity of what had transpired between them. The bond they shared, though unspoken, though impossible to define, was undeniable. Daniel took a cautious step forward, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't sure what he expected, but the lion didn't move away. Instead, Ku stayed rooted to the spot, his eyes never leaving Daniel's. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly, his voice shaking slightly. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he could offer. I'll never forget what you did for me." Ku's gaze softened, though the lion did not respond in any way that Daniel could understand. The silence between them was profound. There was no need for words. The lion had already said everything through his actions. He had saved Daniel, watched over him, and now, as if fulfilling some ancient promise, Ku had come to say goodbye. Slowly, Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. A picture of the cub he had once saved from the poacher's trap. He had carried it with him ever since that day, a reminder of the moment when their lives had intersected. He held it up, showing it to Ku, though he didn't expect the lion to recognize it. "You remember this, don't you?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ku's eyes shifted, narrowing for the briefest of moments. Then, as if to acknowledge Daniel's words, the lion took one slow step forward. It was a gesture of recognition, one that felt full of meaning. For a long time, Daniel just stood there watching the lion. And then, with a final glance, Ku turned and melted into the tall grass, disappearing into the savannah as silently as he had appeared. Daniel stood still for a few moments longer, his heart racing with emotions he couldn't entirely comprehend. He realized now that this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The lions, Ku in particular, had shown him something important. It wasn't just about survival. It was about the quiet, enduring bonds that could form between predator and protector, between man and beast. As Daniel slowly made his way back to the camp, the sun setting behind him, he knew that his life had been forever changed. The lions, the savannah, Ku, all had left an indelible mark on his soul. And as the night fell, he looked up at the sky, the stars beginning to twinkle above. The wild had shown him the true meaning of trust, and he would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his life.